A split-second decision to stop on a stormy night changed the fate of an entire farming community. When 72-year-old Harold Jensen pulled over to help a stranded pregnant woman, he had no idea she was the president of the very bank about to foreclose on his family's century-old farm, a chance encounter that would expose corrupt lending practices, transform rural banking, and ultimately save hundreds of family farms across the Midwest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The relentless spring rain hammered against Harold Jensen's ancient pickup truck as he navigated the muddy back roads of Maple County. At 72, the weathered farmer had developed a heightened awareness of approaching storms, both meteorological and financial, out of decades of necessity rather than choice. 6 months after his wife Martha's extended hospitalization had depleted their modest savings, the third-generation family farm was just weeks away from foreclosure, with the final notice from Midwest Regional Bank sitting unopened on his kitchen table. The property, 160 acres of once thriving cropland and woodlots that had been in his family since 1923, was scheduled for auction on June 15th. The letter from the bank had stated in coldly efficient language that the multiple extensions granted during Martha's illness could not be continued, referring to regrettable but necessary standard foreclosure procedures that Harold knew meant the end of nearly a century of Jensen farming legacy. Another fine mess, Harold muttered to himself as he squinted through the rain-swept windshield. His destination that evening was hardly uplifting. A meeting at the county Grange Hall with other struggling farmers to discuss what many were calling a brewing crisis in rural lending practices. Reports that Midwest Regional Bank had accelerated foreclosures on family farms while approving generous terms for corporate agricultural interests had created simmering resentment throughout the county. He pulled his faded blue work cap lower on his forehead and hunched closer to the steering wheel. His knuckles, permanently swollen from decades of physical labor, gripped the worn steering wheel with tension that reflected more than just concern about the treacherous road conditions. The worn denim overalls and flannel shirt he wore, practical attire for a lifetime of farming, were as much a part of his identity as the calluses on his hands and the perpetual sunburn on the back of his neck. The weather had worsened considerably since he'd left the farm. What had started as a steady drizzle had transformed into sheets of driving rain that reduced visibility to mere yards. Harold considered turning back. The meeting, while important, wasn't worth risking an accident, but his stubborn determination, honed through decades of agricultural challenges, pushed him forward. The crisis facing Maple County's family farmers demanded collective action, not retreat. The road ahead disappeared momentarily in a sudden downpour, causing Harold to slow the truck to a crawl. As visibility returned, he noticed hazard lights blinking about 100 yards ahead, where the county road met Highway 27. A sleek silver sedan had pulled onto the shoulder, hood raised, with a solitary figure standing beside it, seemingly struggling. With a cell phone, Harold's first instinct was to continue past without stopping. The meeting at the Grange Hall started in 20 minutes, and these days, luxury cars along the highway usually belonged to bank representatives or corporate land scouts, people Harold had little interest in assisting. But as his headlights illuminated the scene more clearly, he could see it was a woman, visibly pregnant, her business attire already soaked from the downpour. "Can't just leave her there," he sighed, pulling his truck behind the disabled vehicle. Whatever his feelings about banks and foreclosures, his parents had raised him with principles that didn't waver based on convenience or circumstance. The wipers fought a losing battle against the deluge as Harold parked and reached behind his seat for a weathered umbrella, a practical item in a farmer's truck, though rarely used by Harold himself. He typically worked through rain without much concern, but the stranded woman's condition prompted additional consideration. Stepping into the driving rain, Harold approached the stranded motorist with measured steps, mindful of the slick road surface. "Engine trouble," he called over the drumming of raindrops on his umbrella. The woman turned, revealing a face etched with relief at his arrival. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, professionally dressed despite her advanced pregnancy, with the poised demeanor of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. Current circumstances, however, had clearly pushed beyond her control. "Thank goodness," she replied, lowering her phone. "No cell service out here, and I think it's the alternator. I was heading back to the city after a community meeting when it just died." Harold nodded, recognizing the symptoms immediately. "Mind if I take a look? Been fixing engines since I was 12. Without waiting for an answer, he handed her the umbrella and leaned under the hood, his experienced hands quickly assessing the vehicle's condition, despite the rain soaking through his flannel shirt. The luxury sedan's engine compartment was far more complex than his truck's, but mechanical principles remained consistent across decades of automotive evolution. "Alternator for sure," he confirmed after a brief inspection, pointing to the frayed remnants of what had once been a functioning belt. "Belt's completely shredded too, not something roadside assistance can patch up. You'll need a tow and garage work." The woman sighed, unconsciously resting one hand on her pronounced baby bump. "I was afraid of that. I don't suppose there's a service station nearby?" Harold shook his head, rainwater dripping from the brim of his cap as he straightened up. "Miller's garage is about 15 miles back toward town, but they closed at 5. Next option is in Oak Ridge, 20 miles the other direction." He glanced at his watch, then at the darkening sky and the woman's condition. His meeting at the Grange Hall suddenly seemed far less important than ensuring this pregnant woman wasn't stranded in a worsening storm. Lightning flashed across the horizon, followed seconds later by a deep rumble of thunder that seemed to emphasize the urgency of their situation. "Listen, my farm's just 3 miles up that dirt road," he said, gesturing to an unmarked turnoff. "I've got a landline that works even when the power's out, and you can wait somewhere dry while we arrange a tow. That little one shouldn't be out in this weather," he added, nodding toward her belly. The woman hesitated briefly, assessing her limited options before practicality overcame caution. "That's incredibly kind. I'm Catherine Williams, by the way," she said, extending her hand. "Harold Jensen," he replied with a firm handshake. "Nothing kind about it. Just what neighbors do. Let's get your things from the car." Catherine retrieved a leather briefcase and small overnight bag from her vehicle, which Harold carried to his truck despite her protests that she could manage. The contrast between her designer luggage and his mud-splattered pickup was striking, a visual representation of the widening gap between rural and urban prosperity that had defined Maple County's economic narrative for the past decade. As they drove toward the Jensen farm, Catherine attempted small talk to fill the awkward silence. "Have you lived in the area long, Mr. Jensen?" Harold's weathered face showed a flicker of pride despite his current circumstances. "All my life." Jensen, "Land since my grandfather bought it in 1923. Worked alongside my father until he passed, then took over completely. Raised 3 kids there with my wife Martha. She's in assisted living now. Health took a bad turn last year." "I'm sorry to hear that," Catherine replied sincerely. "It must be difficult managing the farm alone." A shadow crossed Harold's features as he navigated a particularly treacherous curve. "Farm won't be mine to manage much longer. Bank's foreclosing next month. Midwest Regional doesn't seem interested in working with family operations these days." Catherine's expression changed subtly at the mention of the bank, but Harold was focused on navigating the increasingly muddy road and didn't notice. "That seems short-sighted," she said carefully. "Family farms are the backbone of communities like this. Try telling that to whoever's running things now." Harold replied without bitterness, just a matter-of-fact acceptance that seemed more poignant than anger. Used to know every bank manager by name. They understood crop cycles, weather challenges, gave folks flexibility when times got tough. Now decisions come from headquarters in the city by people who've never seen a cornfield up close. He negotiated a particularly deep puddle, the truck's worn suspension protesting audibly. "Nothing personal against your city folk," he added, misinterpreting her silence as offense. "Just different worlds these days." The truck turned onto an even narrower lane, passing beneath a weathered wooden sign that read, Jensen Family Farm, Tegesund, 1923. Through the rain, the silhouettes of a two-story farmhouse, large barn, and several outbuildings emerged, all showing signs of careful maintenance despite their age. Unlike many neighboring properties that had fallen into disrepair as industrial agriculture expanded, Harold's farm retained the dignified appearance of a place loved by its caretaker. Harold parked as close to the back porch as possible, then insisted on making 2 trips through the rain, first escorting Catherine with the umbrella, then returning for her luggage. The simple courtesy seemed so natural to him that Catherine's effusive thanks clearly made him uncomfortable. "No need for all that," he said gruffly. "Anyone would do the same." The farmhouse kitchen where Harold led Catherine was warm and immaculately clean, with the organized simplicity of a space where every item served a practical purpose. Modern appliances were notably absent, replaced by well-maintained equivalents. From earlier decades, a cast-iron wood stove provided both heat and cooking capacity, while kerosene lamps stood ready on countertops, evidence of Harold's pragmatic approach to rural power outages. "Phone's in the hall," he said, gesturing toward an ancient rotary model mounted on the wall. "Still works when everything else fails. Make yourself comfortable while I change into something dry. There's coffee staying warm on the stove if you'd like some." Catherine nodded gratefully, genuinely appreciative of the warmth after the chilling rain. "Thank you, Mr. Jensen. This is very kind." "Harold," he corrected automatically. "Mr. Jensen was my father." As Harold disappeared upstairs, Catherine surveyed the kitchen with growing interest. Amidst the practical rusticity were signs of a rich family history. Photographs spanning generations lined one wall, while carefully preserved farm ledgers dating back decades sat on a small desk in the corner. Most striking was a framed newspaper article from 1968, highlighting the Jensen farm's innovative soil conservation practices, featuring a much younger Harold accepting a County Agricultural Achievement Award. The kitchen table held more recent documents, among them the unmistakable letterhead of Midwest Regional Bank, the unopened foreclosure notice, partially visible beneath a worn Bible. Catherine moved toward it instinctively. Her professional interest piqued, but stopped herself from the intrusion. Instead, she used the wall phone to call for a tow service, arranging for her car to be taken to the nearest service center in Oak Ridge. When Harold returned wearing dry clothes, she was studying a large wall map of Maple County with colored pins, marking various locations. "The tow truck can't make it until morning," she informed him. "I hope it's not an imposition, but they suggested I find accommodation for the night." "You're welcome to our spare room," Harold offered without hesitation. "Not fancy like you're probably used to, but it's clean and warm. Martha would have my hide if I sent a pregnant woman out in weather like this." Catherine smiled at the genuine kindness. "Thank you. I don't want to intrude on your evening, though. Weren't you heading somewhere when you stopped to help me?" Harold waved dismissively. "Just a meeting at the Grange. Nothing that can't wait." He didn't add that the gathering of struggling farmers would continue without him, their collective frustration with Midwest Regional Bank's practices undiminished by his absence. "Those pins," Catherine asked, gesturing to the wall map she'd been examining, "do they represent something specific?" Harold hesitated, then nodded toward the map. Red pins are family farms foreclosed on in the last 18 months. Blue ones are properties bought by Heartland Agricultural Investments after foreclosure, started keeping track when the pattern got too obvious to ignore. Catherine stepped closer to the map, her professional demeanor momentarily replaced by genuine concern. The red pins clustered in several areas of the county, with blue pins overlapping many of them, a visual representation of systematic land consolidation. That's quite a pattern, she observed carefully. More than a pattern, Harold replied, moving to stand beside her. His finger traced a sequence of pins across one section of the map. Franklin's place went first. Strawberry. Farm hit by late frost 3 years running. Bank foreclosed, despite his perfect payment history before that. 2 weeks later, Heartland buys it for 30% below market value. Same story with the Wilsons, Thompsons, Old Man Gunderson. 17 families total, all following the same script. Catherine studied the map more intently. You're suggesting coordination between the bank and this investment company? Harold shrugged. I'm just a farmer, not a financial investigator. But when the same bank that won't give established families an extra 6 months is helping some corporation acquire foreclosed properties below market value before they even hit public auction, doesn't take an economics degree to smell something off. The implication hung in the air between them as Harold moved to the stove, his practical nature reasserting itself through hospitality. You must be hungry. I was planning on breakfast. And for dinner tonight, that work for you? Please don't go to any trouble, Catherine protested. No trouble, Harold replied, already reaching for a cast-iron skillet. Farm fresh eggs and home-cured bacon, one advantage of growing your own food. As Catherine settled at the kitchen table, Harold busied himself preparing a simple meal, the familiar routine of hospitality temporarily displacing his financial worries. His movements were efficient and practiced, revealing a man accustomed to self-sufficiency in all aspects of life. Hope you don't mind breakfast for dinner, he said, expertly cracking eggs into the sizzling skillet. Martha always said breakfast works any time of day, and it's quick to prepare for unexpected company. It smells wonderful, Catherine replied, sincerely. It's been a long time since I've had a home-cooked meal. My husband is more likely to order delivery than cook, and my schedule doesn't leave much time for preparing food. What kind of work keeps you so busy? Harold asked as he set plates on the table, genuinely curious about his unexpected guest. Catherine hesitated momentarily. Financial services, she answered, the deliberate vagueness not lost on Harold. I work with rural development initiatives, among other things. Harold nodded without pressing further, though the term rural development had become something of a loaded phrase among farmers in the county, often code for consolidation and corporate acquisition of family lands. This is delicious, Catherine remarked after her first bite, the simple praise clearly pleasing Harold more than elaborate compliments might have. You mentioned your wife is in assisted living? Harold's weathered features softened with a vulnerability that transformed his appearance. Early onset dementia, then complications. Started with little things, forgetting where she put her gardening tools, repeating stories. By the time we got a proper diagnosis, it was progressing quickly. Treatment helped for a while, but the specialist visits, medications, eventually, the care facility, it all adds up faster than crop profits can keep pace with. The raw honesty of his explanation hung in the air between them, the simple tragedy of a hard-working man who had spent his life caring for others, now unable to protect what mattered most despite his best efforts. Insurance covered some, but not nearly enough, he continued, his matter-of-fact tone making the story more poignant. Had to choose between keeping up with the mortgage or making sure Martha got proper care. Not much of a choice, really. I'm so sorry, Catherine said, softly. Healthcare costs can be devastating even with decent coverage. Harold shrugged philosophically. I'm not looking for sympathy. Plenty of folks have it worse. I had 50 good years with Martha on this land, raised 3 children who went on to college, first in our families to do so. That's success by any measure I care about. Your children aren't interested in taking over the farm? Catherine asked. A complex emotion crossed Harold's features, pride mingled with resignation. They've built good lives elsewhere. Michael's an environmental engineer in Oregon. Sarah teaches at a university in Colorado. And Daniel works for a tech company in Chicago. They offered to help with Martha's care, but they've got their own families, mortgages, student loans still. Wouldn't be right to burden them. As they ate, their conversation gradually eased into more comfortable territory, the changing weather patterns affecting crop cycles, the challenges of maintaining agricultural traditions in a rapidly evolving economy, and shared observations about the strained relationship between rural communities and financial institutions. Harold spoke with the practical wisdom of direct experience, while Catherine offered perspectives that occasionally surprised him with their insight into agricultural economics. People forget that farming isn't just a business, it's a way of life with rhythms that don't fit neatly into quarterly profit reports, he explained, warming to the subject with someone who seemed genuinely interested. When Martha got sick, the hospital bills came due regardless of whether our crops were ready to harvest or market prices were favorable. The old bank managers understood that. They'd work with you through the lean times because they knew you were good for it eventually. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. It seems unfair that preserving that legacy should be so precarious after generations of contribution to the community. Harold shrugged again, his weathered hands cradling a coffee mug. Life's rarely fair. I made peace with losing the farm months ago. What troubles me is seeing the same story playing out across the county. Families who've worked this land for generations being replaced by corporate agriculture that doesn't employ local people or contribute to local businesses. Banks used to be partners in rural prosperity. Now they seem determined to accelerate its decline. The storm outside had intensified again, wind driving rain against the windows with renewed force. Catherine glanced at her watch, then toward the darkness beyond the kitchen. Your husband must be worried with you stranded in this weather, Harold observed. He's away at a conference this week, Catherine replied, but I should send him a message when there's service. Her hand moved unconsciously to her belly as the baby shifted position. When are you due? Harold asked, nodding toward her midsection. 6 more weeks, she answered with a smile. Though my doctor thinks it might be sooner, he's already measuring large. First one? Yes, Catherine admitted. I waited longer than most to start a family. Career came first for many years. Harold nodded without judgment. Each generation makes its own choices. My Sarah was similar, established her career before having children, seems to be working well for her. As the evening progressed, Harold showed Catherine to the spare bedroom, a simple space maintained with meticulous care, despite its infrequent use. Fresh linens smelling of sunshine and lavender covered the bed, while handmade quilts provided both warmth and artistic beauty. A small desk beneath the window held a collection of books ranging from agricultural references to classic literature, revealing the multifaceted intellect behind Harold's humble demeanor. Bathrooms at the end of the hall, he explained. Old plumbing, but it works fine. There's fresh towels in the closet and extra blankets if you get cold. Weather radio says the storm should pass by morning, but you're welcome to stay until your car's fixed regardless. Catherine thanked him sincerely, touched by hospitality that expected nothing in return. As Harold left her to settle in, she found herself drawn to the window overlooking the farm. Despite the darkness and continuing rain, the outlines of carefully maintained fields, orchards, and outbuildings were visible, a heritage of stewardship written into the landscape itself, soon to be erased by financial calculations that recognized value only in immediate returns. In the privacy of the guest room, Catherine opened her briefcase and removed several folders bearing the logo of Midwest Regional Bank. She spread documents across the small desk, revealing loan agreements, foreclosure notices identical to the one on Harold's kitchen table, and maps of Maple County with properties marked in different colors according to their financial status. A separate folder contained correspondence between bank executives and representatives of Heartland Agricultural Investments, communications that mirrored almost exactly the pattern Harold had identified on his wall map. She worked late into the night, occasionally pausing to rest a hand on her active baby, her expression shifting between professional concentration and deepening concern as she cross-referenced information and made detailed notes in a leather-bound journal. Whatever had brought the pregnant woman to Maple County clearly involved more than the community meeting she had mentioned, and her interest in Harold's situation extended beyond ordinary sympathy. At one point, she paused to look at a framed photograph on the bedside table. A younger Harold and Martha standing proudly before a banner reading Maple County Soil Conservation Award, 1989. Their genuine smiles and obvious connection to the land they stewarded created a stark contrast to the sterile financial documents spread before her. Down the hall, Harold lay awake despite his physical exhaustion, wondering about his unexpected guest. Something about Catherine's questions and observations suggested greater familiarity with agricultural finance than her vague financial services description implied. In another time, he might have been more suspicious of her interest, but with foreclosure just weeks away, what secrets remained worth protecting? His thoughts turned to Martha, now residing in Oak Ridge Care Center, her once sharp mind increasingly disconnected from the realities around her. He visited 3 times weekly, reading to her from the farm journals they had kept together for decades, unsure how much she comprehended but unwilling to abandon their shared rituals. He hadn't yet told her about the impending foreclosure. A mercy or a cowardice, he wasn't entirely sure which. What Harold couldn't know as he finally drifted towards sleep was that his simple act of roadside assistance had invited into his home someone with the authority to completely transform his circumstances, and that his honest conversation over a humble dinner had inadvertently provided crucial insights that would soon reshape banking practices throughout the region. The stranded motorist he had rescued was far more than a pregnant woman caught in a storm. She was Catherine Williams Reynolds, the recently appointed president of Midwest Regional Bank, conducting an unannounced assessment of rural lending practices. Following concerning patterns identified by the bank's oversight board, her final thought before sleep claimed her was not about restructuring loans or agricultural economics, but about the fundamental decency of a man who, despite facing the loss of everything he valued, had not hesitated to help a stranger in need. The genuine integrity Harold had demonstrated, without knowing her identity or potential influence, had provided Catherine with something her weeks of formal reviews and financial analyses had not: a human face to the consequences of policies enacted in distant corporate offices by people who had never sat at a farmhouse table or understood what it meant to belong to the land. Outside the farmhouse, the storm gradually subsided, the clearing skies revealing stars above fields that had been tended by the same family for nearly a century. By morning, decisions would be set in motion that would affect not just the Jensen farm, but hundreds of similar operations across the Midwest, all triggered by a chance encounter on a rain-soaked rural road where an old farmer facing foreclosure had stopped to help a stranded woman, completely unaware she was the president of the very bank preparing to take his land. Morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that often follows violent storms, sunlight streaming through the guest room windows to wake Catherine from her restless sleep. The documents she had been reviewing were still spread across the small desk, now illuminated by golden rays that seemed to highlight the stark contrast between the human story she had witnessed and the impersonal financial calculations before her. She dressed quickly in yesterday's clothes, now wrinkled from their hasty drying, and made her way downstairs, following the aroma of fresh coffee and bacon that filled the farmhouse. Harold was already at work in the kitchen, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to early rising. "Morning," he greeted her with a warm smile. "Hope you slept well. Coffee's ready, and breakfast will be done in a few minutes." "Thank you, Harold. You really didn't need to go to all this trouble," Catherine said, accepting a steaming mug gratefully. "No trouble at all," Harold replied, flipping eggs with expert precision. "Been making breakfast at this hour for 50 years. Can't seem to break the habit, even with Martha gone." They ate in companionable silence for a few moments before Harold spoke again. "Tow truck called about 20 minutes ago. They'll be at your car within the hour. Said they'd tow it to Miller's garage in town. Bob Miller's honest and fair with his prices." Catherine nodded, her mind already racing with the implications of what she needed to do next. The conversation from the previous evening had confirmed her worst suspicions about the lending practices at her bank, practices that had preceded her appointment but for which she now bore responsibility. "Harold?" she began carefully, setting down her fork. "I need to tell you something. My last name isn't Williams. It's Williams-Reynolds. I'm the new president of Midwest Regional Bank." The silence that followed was deafening. Harold's hand paused halfway to his coffee mug, his weathered face cycling through surprise, confusion, and finally a resigned understanding. "I see," he said quietly, his voice devoid of the warmth that had characterized their interactions. "Come to survey. Your conquest before the foreclosure?" "No," Catherine said firmly. "I came to Maple County because I'd been receiving reports of concerning patterns in our rural lending practices. The board asked me to conduct a quiet assessment of what was really happening with these foreclosure proceedings." Harold's jaw tightened. "And I suppose I provided you with all the information you needed over dinner last night. Fool that I am, thinking I was just helping a stranded traveler." "You weren't a fool," Catherine insisted, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly as the baby kicked, perhaps sensing the sudden tension. "And nothing about our conversation was calculated on my part. When my car broke down, I truly was just a pregnant woman stranded in a storm. I didn't plan to end up here or to have this conversation. But you didn't correct me when I assumed you were someone else," Harold pointed out, his disappointment evident. Catherine couldn't deny that. "You're right. I should have been upfront once I realized the situation. But Harold, what you showed me last night, your map, your story, the documentation you've kept, it's exactly what I needed to see. Not as bank president, but as someone trying to understand what's really happening to families like yours." Harold stood abruptly, moving to the window to stare out at his fields. "With all due respect, Ms. Williams-Reynolds, people like you can't understand what families like mine are going through. You see numbers on a spreadsheet. I see 3 generations of sweat and sacrifice about to be erased." "You're wrong," Catherine said quietly. "I do understand, more than you might think. My grandfather lost his farm in the 1980s farm crisis. I watched it destroy him, not just financially, but spiritually. He never recovered from losing the land his father had worked." Harold turned slightly, studying her face for signs of deception. Catherine continued, "That's partly why I took this position. The board brought me in specifically because of my background in agricultural lending reform. They knew something was wrong with the rural portfolio, but they didn't know the extent of it until I started investigating." "And what exactly have you found?" Harold asked, his farmer's practicality overcoming his personal hurt. Catherine took a deep breath. I've found evidence of systematic coordination between certain loan officers at our bank and Heartland Agricultural Investments. Foreclosures are being accelerated on properties that Heartland has already identified for acquisition. The patterns you documented on your map match almost exactly with internal communications I've uncovered. Harold's expression shifted from hurt to shock. You mean the conspiracy theories we've been discussing at the Grange are actually true? It appears so, Catherine confirmed. At least 3 loan officers have been receiving kickbacks for identifying vulnerable properties and ensuring foreclosures proceed on a timeline that benefits Heartland. Your farm, Harold, is one of 17 properties specifically targeted in what they call their Northern Corridor Consolidation Project. Harold sank back into his chair, the weight of this revelation visible on his shoulders. We knew something was wrong, but to hear it confirmed. That's not all, Catherine continued. The original assessment of your loan modification request was altered. You actually qualified for extended terms under our agricultural hardship provisions, but someone changed the documentation to ensure denial. Who? Harold's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm still determining the full extent of the network, but the alterations trace back to our regional lending director, Marcus Webb. He's been with the bank for 15 years and has deep connections with Heartland's board. Harold's hands clenched and unclenched on the table. Webb, he's the one who denied my last appeal, told me I was a bad risk despite 40 years of perfect payment history before Martha got sick. He had no authority to make that determination, Catherine said firmly. Under our actual policies, the ones I'm now enforcing, your circumstances clearly qualify for humanitarian consideration. Medical hardship affecting a primary operator is specifically covered. Lot of good that does me now, Harold said bitterly. Foreclosures in 3 weeks. No, Catherine corrected, it's not. I'm exercising my executive authority to halt all rural foreclosures pending a complete review of lending practices. Your farm and the others unfairly targeted will receive immediate stays. Harold looked up sharply, hope warring with skepticism in his eyes. You can do that. I can, and I will, Catherine affirmed. But Harold, I need your help. The documentation. You've compiled the connections you've mapped. It's more comprehensive than anything my internal audit team has produced. You and the other farmers at the Grange have been tracking this pattern longer than anyone. You want us to help you investigate your own bank? Harold asked incredulously. I want you to help me save family farms across the Midwest, Catherine corrected. What's happening in Maple County is happening in agricultural communities throughout our service area. This isn't just about stopping foreclosures. It's about reforming an entire system that's forgotten its purpose. Harold was quiet for a long moment, processing this unexpected turn. Finally, he asked, what about Heartland? They've already bought up half the county. That's where things get complicated, Catherine admitted. The properties they've already acquired through legitimate foreclosures are likely gone, but the properties they obtained through manipulated processes, that's a different matter. There may be legal grounds for challenge, especially if we can prove fraudulent practices. You're talking about taking on some powerful people, Harold observed. Webb has connections throughout the state. Heartland's board includes former senators and industry leaders. They won't go down without a fight. Catherine's expression hardened with determination. Then it's a fight they'll get. But Harold, I can't do this alone. I need farmers like you to come forward to share their stories and documentation. We need to build a case so strong that even their connections can't protect them. And if we help you, Harold asked carefully, what happens to farms like mine? We restructure the loans properly, Catherine outlined. Extended terms that reflect agricultural reality, not quarterly profit expectations. Payment schedules that account for seasonal variations and market fluctuations. And most importantly, recognition that family farms aren't just businesses, they're vital community assets that deserve protection. Harold stood again, this time moving to his wall map. 17 families, you said. In the Northern Corridor project alone, Catherine confirmed, but our initial analysis suggests over 60 farms across the region have been similarly targeted. Harold traced his finger across the map, touching each red pin like a rosary bead. The Wilsons have already moved to town. Their boy Jeff had to drop out of college to help pay rent. The Thompsons are living with their daughter in Omaha. Old man Gunderson, his voice caught slightly. He died 2 months after losing his farm. Heart attack, they said, but his wife thinks it was heartbreak. We can't undo what's been done, Catherine said softly, but we can prevent it from happening to others. And for farms that haven't been sold yet, there might be options for restoration. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an ancient clock on the mantel. Finally, Harold turned back to face her. You should have told me who you were last night. You're right, Catherine agreed. I was wrong to let you believe I was just a stranded motorist. But Harold, would you have been as honest if you'd known? Would you have shown me the map, told me about Martha, explained the real impact of these foreclosures? Harold considered this. Probably not, he admitted. I would have seen you as the enemy. Am I? Catherine asked directly. The enemy. Harold studied her for a long moment. I don't know yet. Actions speak louder than words, especially from bankers. But... He paused, seeming to wrestle with his next words. The fact that you stayed the night, sat at my table, listened to my story, that counts for something. The executives who've been destroying our communities wouldn't have done that. Catherine's phone buzzed with a message from the tow service, but she ignored it. Harold, I need to ask you something. Would you be willing to come with me to the bank today? I want to call an emergency meeting with the other affected farmers, and your presence would lend credibility I can't manufacture. You want me to walk into the bank that's foreclosing on me and tell other farmers to trust you? Harold's tone was skeptical, but not dismissive. I want you to walk into the bank as my advisor on agricultural affairs, Catherine corrected. If you're willing, I'd like to formalize that role. Paid position, of course, consulting on rural lending reform. Harold almost smiled. Trying to buy my cooperation? Trying to put your expertise to good use, Catherine countered. You understand this community and its needs better than any MBA on my staff. If we're going to reform our practices, we need voices like yours at the table. Before Harold could respond, they heard a vehicle approaching. Through the window, they could see the tow truck turning into the drive. That's my ride, Catherine observed. I should get going. But Harold, think about what I've said. The meeting is at 2 o'clock, main conference room at the bank. Harold walked her to the door, carrying her luggage as he had the night before. At the porch, he paused. That baby of yours is going to be born into interesting times. Catherine smiled ruefully. If I can help create a better system before he arrives, maybe his generation won't have to fight these same battles. He? Harold raised an eyebrow. Latest ultrasound, Catherine confirmed. Though my husband insists, technology can be wrong and keeps buying neutral colors. The tow truck driver was efficient and professional, loading Catherine's sedan while she and Harold completed their goodbyes. As she was about to leave, Harold spoke. 2 o'clock, you said? Yes, Catherine confirmed, hope rising in her chest. I'll be there, Harold decided, and I'll bring the others, but Ms. Williams-Reynolds, Catherine, will be watching. One sign that this is just corporate maneuvering, and you'll lose us forever. I understand, Catherine said solemnly. I won't let you down. As the tow truck pulled away with Catherine in the cab, Harold stood on his porch, watching until they disappeared down the lane. Then he went inside and picked up his phone. He had calls to make, farmers to convince, and a community to rally. The drive to town gave Catherine time to plan her approach. She called her assistant, instructing her to prepare the conference room and alert security that she would be bringing in a group of farmers for an emergency meeting. She also called the bank's legal counsel, warning them to be on standby. "Mrs. Williams Reynolds," her assistant said carefully, "Mr. Webb has been trying to reach you all morning. He seems quite agitated about some holds you've placed on foreclosure proceedings." "I'm sure he is," Catherine replied dryly. "Tell Mr. Webb he's welcome to attend the 2 o'clock meeting, if he'd like his concerns addressed." By the time Catherine reached the bank building, a gleaming glass and steel structure that seemed almost obscene in its opulence compared to the struggling farms surrounding the town, she had received 17 calls from various department heads. Word of her foreclosure moratorium had spread quickly. She entered through the executive entrance, avoiding the main lobby where she suspected several anxious loan officers might be waiting. In her office, she found Marcus Webb pacing before her. "Desk." "Catherine," he began, his tone carefully modulated between deference and condescension, "I understand you've placed some holds on routine foreclosure proceedings. While I appreciate your concern for community relations, these decisions were made after careful analysis." "Sit down, Marcus," Catherine interrupted, moving behind her desk with an authority that surprised them both. "We need to discuss the Northern Corridor Consolidation Project." Webb's face paled slightly. "I'm not familiar with that term." "Really?" Catherine pulled a folder from her briefcase, one of the documents she'd reviewed at Harold's farmhouse. "Because your signature appears on several internal memos referencing it, along with projected profit margins for Heartland agricultural investments." Webb straightened his tie nervously. "I've had routine communications with Heartland, yes. They're a legitimate investment firm interested in agricultural properties. There's nothing improper about accelerating foreclosures on specific properties Heartland had already identified." Catherine interrupted again. "About altering loan modification assessments to ensure denials, about receiving what your personal bank records show as consulting fees from Heartland's subsidiary." Webb stood abruptly. "I don't have to listen to these accusations. I've been with this bank for 15 years, yes," Catherine completed, "which is why I'm giving you this opportunity to explain yourself before I turn this over to federal investigators." "Sit down, Marcus, please," Webber sat, his arrogance deflating like a punctured balloon. Catherine leaned forward. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to provide a complete accounting of every farm foreclosure you've overseen in the past 5 years. You're going to identify every altered document, every kickback, every communication with Heartland. And you're going to do it before 2 o'clock. "That's impossible," Webb protested. "Then I suggest you get started," Catherine said coldly. "Because at 2 o'clock, I'll be meeting with the farmers whose lives you've destroyed. If I don't have answers for them, I'll have no choice but to involve law enforcement immediately." Webb's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the folder. "What happens if I cooperate?" "That depends on what you reveal," Catherine answered. "But I can guarantee that stonewalling will result in criminal prosecution. The evidence I already have is sufficient for that." After Webb left, Catherine spent the remaining time before the meeting reviewing additional files and preparing her presentation. She changed into a fresh suit from the spare she kept in her office, trying to project both authority and approachability. At 1:45, her assistant knocked. "Ma'am, the farmers are arriving. Should I show them to the conference room?" "Yes, please. And Sarah, make sure they're offered coffee and refreshments, real food, not just the usual corporate pastries." Catherine watched from her office window as pickup trucks filled the visitor parking lot. She counted at least 30 vehicles, more than she had expected. Harold's influence, she realized, extended beyond what she had imagined. When she entered the conference room at precisely 2 o'clock, she found it packed with men and women in work clothes, their faces showing a mixture of skepticism, hope, and barely contained anger. Harold stood near the front, having changed into clean clothes, but still wearing his work boots. "Thank you all for coming," Catherine began, standing at the head of the table rather than sitting. "I know this bank hasn't given you much reason to trust it lately, but I'm here to change that." "Pretty words," someone called from the back. "We've heard them before." Catherine nodded. "You're right. Words aren't enough. So let me start with actions. Effective immediately, all agricultural foreclosures are suspended pending review. Not delayed. Suspended." A murmur ran through the room. "Furthermore," Catherine continued, "any farm foreclosed upon in the past 6 months, under questionable circumstances, will be investigated for possible reversal of sale." "How do we know you won't just wait us out?" A woman Catherine recognized as Mrs. Thompson asked. "Suspend things until the media attention dies down, then proceed as planned." "Because you're going to help me make sure that doesn't happen," Catherine answered. "I'm forming a rural advisory committee composed of local farmers to oversee all agricultural lending decisions. No farm foreclosure will proceed without this committee's review." The room erupted in conversation. Harold raised his hand for quiet. "Let her finish," he said, his gravelly voice carrying natural authority. Catherine smiled gratefully at him. "I've also discovered evidence of criminal misconduct in our lending practices. Several bank employees have been colluding with outside investment firms to manipulate foreclosures. Federal investigators will be involved and prosecutions will follow." "What about the farms already lost?" someone asked. "Where properties were obtained through fraudulent means, legal action will be taken to reverse the sales," Catherine promised. "I can't guarantee we'll recover every farm, but we'll fight for each one." An elderly man Catherine didn't recognize stood slowly. "Young lady, I've been farming in this county for 60 years. I've heard promises from 5 different bank presidents. What makes you different?" Catherine thought of her grandfather, of the farm he'd lost, of the baby growing inside her. "Because I've seen what happens when we break faith with rural communities. My grandfather lost his farm in the 1980s. It destroyed him. I won't be part of perpetuating that cycle." The man studied her for a long moment, then nodded and sat down. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, with Catherine outlining specific policy changes, timeline commitments, and accountability measures. She introduced the bank's chief counsel, who explained the legal ramifications of the fraud they'd uncovered. She presented financial projections showing how sustainable agricultural lending could be profitable without being predatory. Throughout it all, she noticed Harold watching, occasionally nodding or interjecting a clarifying point. His presence lent her credibility she couldn't have achieved alone. As the meeting wound down, Mrs. Thompson approached. "My husband passed last month," she said quietly. "The stress of losing the farm. It was too much for his heart. Can your changes bring him back?" Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. "No," she said honestly. "I can't undo the damage that's been done, but I can try to ensure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly. "That's something, I suppose." After the farmers had left, Harold remained behind. "That went better than I expected," he admitted. "Thanks to you," Catherine said. "Your credibility made the difference." Harold shrugged. "You still have to deliver on those promises." "I will," Catherine assured him, "but I meant what I said about the advisory position. Will you consider it?" "I'll think about it," Harold allowed. "But first, I want to see Webb and his cronies held accountable, and I want to see the Thompsons get their farm back." "You will," Catherine promised. As Harold prepared to leave, he turned back. "Catherine, thank you for stopping last night. Whatever your reasons, you helped a stranger in a storm." "That matters," Catherine smiled. "Thank you for stopping for me. You could have driven past." "No," Harold said simply. "I couldn't have. It's not who I am. Nor could I drive past what's happening to farms like yours," Catherine replied. "It's Not who I want to be. Harold nodded once, then left. Catherine remained in the empty conference room, staring at the wall of windows overlooking the town. Somewhere out there, families were receiving calls about their stayed foreclosures. Somewhere, Webb was deciding whether to cooperate or flee. Somewhere, a system that had lost its way was beginning to correct course. Her hand moved to her belly as the baby kicked. "Change is coming, little one," she whispered. "Your mother's making sure of it." The sun was setting by the time Catherine finally left her office. She had calls to make, documents to review, and a board of directors to convince. But for the first time since taking this position, she felt she was on the right path. As she drove past the farms surrounding the town, she thought of Harold, probably doing his evening chores, checking on animals and equipment with the same dedication he'd shown for decades. She thought of all the Harolds across the Midwest, fighting to preserve not just their livelihoods, but their heritage. Tomorrow would bring challenges. Webb's response, Heartland's legal team, internal resistance to change. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. A storm had brought unlikely allies together, and from that chance encounter, reform was beginning. Her phone rang, her husband calling from his conference. "How did the site visit go?" he asked, unaware of how much had transpired. "It was transformative," Catherine said, smiling at the understatement. "I'll tell you all about it when you get home. How's the conference?" As she listened to him describe presentations on financial innovation, Catherine reflected on the irony. The most innovative thing she'd done wasn't some complex financial instrument. It was simply listening to a farmer over breakfast in his kitchen, seeing the human cost of policies designed in sterile boardrooms. Later that night, in her modern, suburban home that felt oddly sterile after Harold's warm farmhouse, Catherine pulled out her laptop and began drafting new lending guidelines. At the top of the page, she typed, "Principles for Ethical Agricultural Finance." The first principle she wrote was simple. Every loan represents a family, a heritage, and a community. Decisions must reflect this human reality, not just financial metrics. She thought Harold would approve. As she worked late into the night, occasionally pausing when the baby's movements demanded attention, Catherine felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since taking the bank presidency. She had found her mission, rebuilding trust between financial institutions and the communities they were meant to serve. It wouldn't be easy. Entrenched interests would resist. Shareholders would question the short-term profit implications. But sometimes, Catherine reflected, change begins with something as simple as a flat tire on a rainy night and a stranger kind enough to stop and help. By dawn, she had completed a comprehensive reform proposal. As the sun rose over the Midwest farmland, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, Catherine felt the baby kick strongly. "I know, little one," she murmured. "It's a new day." Indeed it was. For her, for Harold, for the farming communities of the Midwest, and for a banking system about to remember its true purpose. The storm had passed, but the real work was just beginning. The following weeks brought a whirlwind of activity that transformed not just Midwest Regional Bank, but the entire community of Maple County. Catherine Williams Reynolds arrived at the bank each morning before dawn, her pregnancy advancing, but her determination unwavering. The executive parking lot that once held only luxury sedans now regularly featured Harold Jensen's battered pickup truck alongside other farm vehicles as the Rural Advisory Committee took shape. Marcus Webb's cooperation had been swift but incomplete. Faced with mounting evidence and the threat of federal prosecution, he had provided documentation implicating 2 other loan officers and revealing the depth of Heartland Agricultural Investments scheme. However, key records had mysteriously disappeared, and Webb himself vanished one night, leaving behind only a resignation letter and empty file cabinets. "He's probably halfway to the Cayman Islands by now," Harold observed during one of their morning meetings, stirring sugar into his coffee with the deliberate patience of a man accustomed to seasonal rhythms. Catherine frowned at the stack of subpoenas on her desk. The FBI will find him. What matters now is that we have enough evidence to void the fraudulent foreclosures and begin prosecutions of Heartland's executives. The legal battles had begun immediately after Catherine's reforms. Were announced. Heartland Agricultural Investments, backed by powerful attorneys and political connections, challenged every stayed foreclosure and threatened lawsuits against the bank for breach of contract. The media attention was intense, with national news. Outlets picking up the story of the pregnant bank president taking on agricultural corruption. "You've got reporters camping out in the lobby again," Harold informed her, glancing out the window of her office. "That lady from CNN is particularly persistent." Catherine sighed, one hand unconsciously moving to her expanding belly. At 7 months pregnant, the physical demands of her reform campaign were taking their toll, but she refused to slow down. "We'll do another press conference at noon. The public pressure is actually helping. Heartland's investors don't like the negative attention." The transformation of the bank's culture was perhaps the most visible change. Loan officers, who had once viewed farmers as mere credit risks, now attended mandatory sessions led by Harold and other committee members, learning about agricultural cycles, weather impacts, and the generational nature of family farming. The sterile corporate atmosphere began to soften as farmers became regular visitors, their work boots and plain speaking bringing authenticity to hallways that had known only polished shoes and corporate jargon. One morning, 3 weeks after the initial meeting, Catherine found Harold in the conference room, surrounded by maps, financial projections, and weather data. He had officially accepted the advisory position and threw himself into the work with the same dedication he brought to farming. "The Wilsons' case is complicated," he explained as she entered. "Heartland subdivided their property immediately. After purchase, part of it's already been developed into a distribution center. But the house and the original 40 acres are still intact." Catherine studied the documents. The sale was clearly fraudulent. Webb admitted to altering their refinancing application. "Legal says we have grounds to challenge the entire transaction." "It's not just about the land," Harold said quietly. "Jim Wilson's grandfather planted the oak grove behind their house. His kids carved their initials in the barn beams. You can't restore that once it's bulldozed for a warehouse." These conversations had become central to Catherine's understanding of her mission. Each foreclosure wasn't just a financial transaction. It was the erasure of family history, community connections, and agricultural heritage that couldn't be quantified in spreadsheets. The first major victory came when a federal judge granted an injunction halting all Heartland property transfers pending investigation. The FBI had raided Heartland's offices, seizing records that corroborated the evidence Catherine and Harold had compiled. Several executives were arrested, and the company's stock price plummeted. "Look at this," Harold said one afternoon, showing Catherine a newspaper article. "Heartland's CEO is claiming they were just making strategic agricultural investments and had no knowledge of any banking irregularities." Catherine snorted. "Strategic investments that happen to align perfectly with our foreclosure timeline? The prosecutors will have a field day with that defense." As autumn progressed, the transformation became tangible. The Thompsons were the first family to have their foreclosure reversed, returning to their farm in an emotional homecoming that drew media coverage from across the country. Mrs. Thompson, widow of the man whose stress-induced heart attack had galvanized Catherine's resolve, wept openly as she walked through her front door. "Tom would have been so proud," she whispered to Catherine at the celebration gathering. "You kept your promise." The success created momentum. Other banks in the region began reviewing their agricultural lending practices, wary of similar scandals. Catherine was invited to testify before a congressional committee on predatory agricultural lending. Her testimony, delivered while obviously pregnant, became a powerful image that resonated nationwide. Family farming isn't just about food production. She told the committee, Harold seated behind her as her agricultural advisor. It's about community stability, environmental stewardship, and preserving a way of life that defines rural America. When banks forget this, we don't just lose farms, we lose the soul of our communities. The changes at Midwest Regional went beyond policy. Catherine instituted a profit-sharing program where the bank's agricultural lending success was tied to the long-term viability of farm operations, not just short-term returns. Loan officers received bonuses based on farm sustainability metrics developed by the Rural Advisory Committee. "You're turning conventional banking on its head," the chairman of the board told Catherine during one tense meeting. "Shareholders are nervous. They should be nervous about the alternative," Catherine responded firmly. "We were facing federal investigation, mass litigation, and complete loss of community trust. Our stock price has actually improved since we began reforms. Ethical banking is ultimately profitable banking." Harold's influence extended beyond his official role. He began conducting farm reality sessions for bank employees, taking them to actual operations to see the challenges farmers faced. Young loan officers, who had only known agricultural lending through computer models, found themselves knee-deep in cornfields, learning about soil quality, water table levels, and the 1,000 variables that affected farm success. "This is what you're really financing," Harold told one group, standing in his own fields as autumn harvest approached. "Not just land and equipment, but knowledge passed down through generations, communities that support each other, and food security for the nation." The personal relationship between Catherine and Harold evolved from professional collaboration to genuine friendship. He became her sounding board for difficult decisions, while she offered him insights into financial strategies that could benefit not just his farm, but the entire agricultural community. "Martha would have liked you," Harold said one evening as they reviewed loan applications together. "She always said the banks needed more people who understood that money was just a tool, not the goal itself." Catherine smiled, her hand resting on her belly as the baby moved. "I wish I could have met her. From everything you've told me, she was remarkable." "She was," Harold agreed, his voice soft with memory. "When I visit her now, I tell her about what we're doing here. Sometimes I think she understands. Her eyes light up when I mention the families getting their farms back." The legal proceedings against Heartland accelerated as more evidence emerged. Internal emails showed executives joking about harvesting farms and calculating profits from forced sales. Webb was eventually located in Costa Rica and extradited, his testimony providing crucial details about the conspiracy. One particularly damaging email from Heartland's CEO to Webb read, "Remember, we need the Jensen property to complete the Northern Corridor, whatever it takes to ensure that foreclosure proceeds on schedule." "Whatever it takes," Harold repeated, reading over Catherine's shoulder. "They saw us as nothing more than obstacles to their profits." "Not anymore," Catherine said firmly. "We're making sure this never happens again." The transformation wasn't without challenges. Some shareholders did rebel, attempting to oust Catherine at a board meeting. The confrontation became heated when one investor accused her of emotional decision-making and suggested her pregnancy was affecting her judgment. Catherine stood slowly, her presence commanding despite her advanced pregnancy. "Emotional? Yes, I'm emotional about families losing generational homes to fraud. I'm emotional about communities being destroyed by predatory lending. And if being pregnant makes me more aware of the legacy we're leaving for the next generation, then I'm grateful for that perspective." The board voted overwhelmingly to support her continued leadership. As Catherine entered her 8th month of pregnancy, the pace of change showed no signs of slowing. The Rural Advisory Committee had expanded beyond Maple County, becoming a model for agricultural regions nationwide. Harold found himself traveling to other states, sharing the committee's approach with farming communities facing similar challenges. "Never thought I'd be wearing a suit and giving presentations," he admitted after returning from a conference in Iowa. "But if it helps other farmers avoid what we went through, it's worth it." The restored farms began thriving under the new lending structures. Flexible payment schedules aligned with harvest cycles, emergency provisions for weather disasters, and support for sustainable farming practices created a partnership model that benefited both bank and borrowers. One afternoon, Catherine received a call that epitomized the transformation. "Mrs. Williams Reynolds, this is Jake Wilson, Jim and Patricia's son. I just wanted to thank you. I was able to leave my job in Chicago and come home to help with the farm. My kids will grow up where I did because of what you've done." Such moments made the long hours and political battles worthwhile. Catherine shared the call with Harold, who smiled knowingly. That's what it's really about, keeping families together, communities whole. The media attention continued, with Catherine becoming an unexpected symbol of corporate reform. Her visible pregnancy during congressional testimony and shareholder battles had created a powerful narrative, new life bringing new hope to struggling communities. "You're going to have one famous baby," Harold observed after another news crew left the bank. Catherine laughed. "I just hope he appreciates what we've built here. This is his legacy too." The final Heartland trial concluded just 2 weeks before Catherine's due date. The company's executives received federal prison sentences, and court-ordered restitution funded a regional farm assistance program. The verdict was seen as a watershed moment in agricultural finance reform. That evening, Harold found Catherine in her office, reviewing the final settlement documents. "You should be home resting," he chided gently. "I needed to see it finished," she replied. "All those families who lost their farms, at least now there's some justice." Harold sat across from her, his weathered face showing the satisfaction of a harvest completed. "You know what the real victory is. It's not the trials or the restitution, it's that my neighbors trust banks again. Young farmers can get loans to start operations. Farm kids can see a future in agriculture." Catherine nodded, then winced as a contraction rippled through her. "I think someone else wants to celebrate the victory," she said, breathing through the pain. Harold's eyes widened. "Is it time?" "I think so," Catherine admitted. "Would you mind driving me to the hospital? I came alone today, and David's still at his conference." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Their relationship had begun with Harold driving Catherine somewhere in a storm, and now it came full circle. "Of course," Harold said, helping her to her feet. "Let's get you to the hospital." The drive was less dramatic than their first journey together, but no less meaningful. Harold's truck navigated the familiar roads as Catherine timed contractions. "You transformed more than just banking," Harold said as they drove. "You showed us that. Change is possible when good people stand up to corruption. My grandchildren will grow up in a different world because of what you've done." Catherine smiled through another contraction. "We did it together, Harold. I couldn't have succeeded without you and the committee. You gave me credibility, but more importantly, you gave me understanding." At the hospital, Harold stayed until Catherine's husband arrived, having rushed back from his conference. As he prepared to leave, Harold took Catherine's hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for stopping that night, for listening, for caring, for everything. Thank you for helping." "A stranger in a storm," Catherine replied. "That act of kindness changed everything." Harold nodded, emotion clear in his eyes. Take care of that boy. Raise him to understand that money serves people, not the other way around." "I will," Catherine promised. "And Harold, consider yourself his honorary grandfather. He'll need to learn about farming from someone who understands its true value." Harold's smile was radiant. "I'd be honored." 8 hours later, as dawn broke over the Midwest farmland, Catherine held her newborn son. Through the hospital window, she could see the agricultural landscape that had become so central to her life. Fields ready for harvest, farms saved from foreclosure, communities rebuilding. She had asked the nurse to call Harold with the news. When the phone rang, she answered eagerly. "Congratulations!" Harold's warm voice came through. "What's his name?" Catherine looked at her son, thinking of the journey that had brought them here. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Harold Williams Reynolds, after the Thompsons and after you." The silence on the other end was long before Harold's emotion-thick voice responded. That's a fine name. He'll carry it well." Over the following months, the reforms Catherine had initiated became industry standards. The Midwest Regional model was studied in business schools, and the Rural Advisory Committee concept spread nationwide. Harold, now a nationally recognized advocate for family farming, split his time between his own operations and consulting work. Baby Thomas became a regular visitor to the bank, often sleeping in his carrier during committee meetings while his mother continued her reform work. The sight of the bank president nursing her infant while discussing agricultural finance became a powerful symbol of the institution's transformation. 1 year after that stormy night, Harold and Catherine stood in his fields, watching the harvest begin. Thomas, now a sturdy toddler, played in the dirt at their feet. "Look at this yield," Harold said proudly. "Best in 15 years. Having stable financing, knowing the bank understands our challenges, it makes all the difference." Catherine bounced Thomas on her hip as he reached for a wheat stalk. "The bank's agricultural portfolio is the strongest it's been in decades. Turns out that when you invest in communities rather than exploit them, everyone prospers." "Who would have thought," Harold mused, "that a blown alternator in a thunderstorm would lead to all this?" Catherine smiled, watching Thomas examine the wheat with intense concentration. Sometimes the most important journeys begin with unexpected detours. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Thomas toddling between them, the landscape told the story of their transformation. Where once foreclosure signs had dotted the country roads, now harvest equipment worked fields owned by families who had farmed them for generations. The bank that had threatened to destroy this community had become its strongest partner. The storm that brought them together had passed, but the changes it catalyzed would ripple through generations, in boardrooms and farm fields, in congressional hearings and community meetings. The story was told of a banker who learned to see beyond spreadsheets and a farmer who helped transform an industry. And at the center of it all was a simple truth Harold had shared that first night. Sometimes, you can't just drive past someone in need, because helping others is not just what you do, it's who you are. That principle, applied to banking, had changed everything. As the sun set over the Midwest farmland, painting the sky gold like ripened wheat, Catherine reflected on the words she would one day tell Thomas about this place and these people. She would tell him about honor and integrity, about the courage to stand against corruption, and about how his middle name came from a man who stopped to help a stranger in a storm. But most of all, she would tell him that real wealth isn't measured in profits extracted from communities, but in communities strengthened and preserved for future generations. It was a lesson learned not in any business school, but in a farmhouse. Kitchen over fresh eggs and honest conversation. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a chance encounter on a stormy night had become a movement that reshaped American agricultural finance. And in the fields of Maple County, Where Harold Jensen still farmed the land his grandfather had bought, the harvest continued, symbols of resilience, renewal, and the enduring power of human decency to create lasting change. 5 years had passed since that fateful storm brought Harold Jensen and Catherine Williams Reynolds together on a muddy back road. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the Midwest Regional Bank's new Agricultural Heritage Center, a building that embodied the transformation of an institution once known for foreclosures into a champion of family farming. Catherine stood at the podium, her 5-year-old son Thomas fidgeting beside her in his miniature suit. The crowd gathered for the center's dedication included farmers, bankers, politicians, and journalists, a testament to how far their movement had spread beyond Maple County. "This center represents more than a building," Catherine began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had reshaped an entire industry. "It's a promise that financial institutions will never again forget their responsibility to the communities they serve." In the front row, Harold Jensen sat with Martha, who had been moved to a specialized care facility closer to home thanks to the financial stability he'd regained. Though her dementia had progressed, she seemed to understand the importance of the moment, her eyes bright as she held Harold's weathered hand. The Agricultural Heritage Center housed not just meeting rooms and offices, but also an archive documenting the 2019 farming crisis and its resolution. Display cases held evidence from the Heartland trials, photographs of restored farms, and testimonies from families whose land had been saved. At the entrance, a bronze plaque bore a simple inscription, "In honor of those who stop to help strangers." In storms, Thomas tugged at Catherine's skirt, and she lifted him to the podium. "This is Thomas Harold Williams Reynolds," she announced to warm laughter. "He's heard the story of how Mr. Harold helped his mommy so many times, he could probably—" "Tell it himself! Mr. Harold fixed Mommy's car!" Thomas announced proudly into the microphone, causing the audience to erupt in affectionate applause. Harold rose slowly, Martha's hand still in his, and made his way to the podium. At 77, he moved with the careful deliberation of age, but his eyes retained the sharp awareness that had recognized patterns others missed. "5 years ago, I nearly drove past a broken-down car in a storm," he began, his gravelly voice carrying across the crowd. "I'm grateful every day that I didn't. That simple decision to stop led to changes none of us could have imagined." He paused, looking out at the familiar faces, the Wilsons, the Thompsons, dozens of families whose farms had been saved. "But the real lesson isn't about one night or one decision. It's about what happens when good people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable." The ceremony continued with other speakers, including the state's governor, who announced that the Maple County model of agricultural lending reform was being adopted as federal policy. The legislation, informally known as the Jensen-Williams Act, mandated rural advisory committees for all agricultural lending institutions and established strict penalties for predatory practices. After the formalities, the crowd dispersed into the center for a reception featuring food from local farms, a deliberate choice that highlighted the connection between financial policy and agricultural reality. Catherine found Harold sitting with Martha in the center's garden, Thomas playing nearby with other children. "How's she doing today?" Catherine asked, sitting beside them on the bench. "It's a good day," Harold replied, his arm protective around Martha's shoulders. She recognized Thomas earlier, called him the miracle baby. Martha turned to Catherine with a moment of startling clarity. "You're the one who saved our farm," she said softly. "Harold saved it," Catherine corrected gently. "I just helped him do it." Martha nodded, seeming satisfied, then returned to watching the children play. "The doctors say these moments of recognition are getting rarer," Harold admitted quietly. "But at least she's comfortable, close to home. That wouldn't have been possible without everything that's changed." Thomas ran over, clutching a drawing he'd made. "Look, Mr. Harold, I drew your farm." Harold examined the crayon illustration seriously. "That's fine work, Thomas. You got the barn just right. Are you going to be an artist?" "I'm going to be a farmer banker," Thomas announced. "Like you and Mommy." The adults laughed, but Catherine felt a deep satisfaction at her son's words. He was growing up in a world where those two professions were partners, not adversaries. As the afternoon progressed, Catherine made her way through the crowd, greeting farmers whose stories had become part of her life's work. Jake Wilson, now managing his family's farm, introduced his twin daughters. The Thompson grandchildren, who might never have known their family's land, played in the Heritage Center's playground. "Hard to believe it all started with a flat tire," Margaret Thompson observed, joining Catherine by the refreshment table. "Harold likes to say it was a blown alternator, not a flat tire," Catherine corrected with a smile. "He's very particular about the mechanical details." Margaret chuckled. "That sounds like Harold. You know, my late husband Tom would have loved to see this. The idea that his death contributed to changing the system, it would have meant everything to him. He's remembered," Catherine assured her, gesturing toward the memorial wall inside the center where Tom Thompson's name appeared, alongside others who had lost their lives to the stress of foreclosure. His story helped convince Congress that reform wasn't just about money, it was about lives. The wall had been Harold's idea, insisted upon despite some board members' concerns about dwelling on the past. "We remember our mistakes, so we don't repeat them," he had argued, and Catherine had backed him completely. As the sun began to set, the crowd gradually thinned. Catherine found Harold preparing to take Martha back to her care facility, Thomas helping by carrying Martha's purse with exaggerated care. "I'll see you next week for the advisory committee meeting?" Catherine asked. Harold nodded. "Wouldn't miss it. We're reviewing those new sustainable agriculture loans, right?" "Yes, and the proposal for the Young Farmer Initiative," Catherine confirmed. The program, designed to help new farmers enter the industry, had been another of Harold's passionate projects. "Good. We need fresh blood in farming, but they need support to get started," Harold said. Then, more quietly, "Catherine, I've been thinking about succession planning for my own place." Catherine's eyebrows rose. Harold had always seemed as permanent as the land itself. "I'm not going anywhere yet," he assured her. "But I'm 77. Martha needs more care. I want to make sure the farm stays in good hands." "Your children have their own lives," Harold finished. "But Jake Wilson, he's been helping me out, learning the operation. He's got good instincts and respects the land. I'm thinking of bringing him in as a partner, eventually transitioning ownership." "That sounds like a wonderful solution," Catherine said. "If you need any help structuring the arrangement, I know where to find the best agricultural banker in the Midwest," Harold said with a wry smile. Thomas had been listening with the intense focus children sometimes display. "Will Mr. Jake let me visit the cows?" "I'm sure he will," Harold assured him. "The farm will always be open to you, Thomas. You're as much a part of its story as anyone." As Harold and Martha departed, Catherine and Thomas walked through the Heritage Center one more time. The building was quiet now, but the displays told powerful stories. Newspaper clippings chronicled the rise and fall of Heartland agricultural investments. Court documents detailed the convictions of Webb and his co-conspirators. Photos showed farm families returning to their land. "Mommy, why did those bad people try to take the farms?" Thomas asked, studying a display about the foreclosure crisis. Catherine knelt beside her son. "Sometimes people forget that money is supposed to help communities, not hurt them. They got greedy and didn't care who they harmed. But you and Mr. Harold stopped them." "We helped stop them," Catherine corrected. "But it took many people working together. Farmers, honest bankers, lawyers, politicians, journalists. Change happens when good people unite against injustice. Thomas nodded solemnly, processing this lesson with the seriousness only a 5-year-old could manage. Later that evening, after Thomas was asleep, Catherine sat in her home office, reviewing the latest reports. The agricultural portfolio of Midwest Regional had become the strongest in the nation, with default rates near historic lows. The model of partnership between lenders and farmers had proven not just ethically superior, but financially sound. Her phone rang. A reporter from the Wall Street Journal, wanting comment on the Federal Reserve's adoption of similar lending principles. The Maple County model proves that ethical banking is profitable banking, Catherine told the reporter. When we invest in communities rather than exploit them, everyone benefits: shareholders, customers, and society. After the call, she walked to Thomas's room, watching him sleep with his favorite toy tractor clutched in his arms. On his wall hung a framed photo from the day of his birth, Harold holding him in the hospital, the old farmer's face radiant with joy. The next morning brought more evidence of lasting change. Catherine arrived at the bank to find a delegation from Japan studying their agricultural lending practices. The Maple County model had gone international, with banks from Europe to Asia sending representatives to learn how community partnership could transform finance. The key is local knowledge, Catherine explained to the visitors, introducing Harold and other committee members. Bankers sitting in distant offices can't understand the realities of farming. That's why we embedded farmers in our decision-making process. Harold demonstrated the committee's review process, showing how they evaluated loan applications, not just on financial metrics, but on sustainability, community impact, and generational planning. In Japan, we also value long-term thinking, one visitor observed. Your approach aligns with our philosophy of Sanpo Yoshi, good for seller, buyer, and society. That's exactly right, Harold confirmed. A farm loan isn't just a transaction between bank and borrower. It affects the entire community, local businesses, schools, the environment. We consider all stakeholders. The international attention had brought opportunities and challenges. Catherine had been offered positions at major global banks, all wanting to replicate her success. She had declined them all, committed to the community that had taught her the true meaning of banking. Why leave? She explained to a headhunter who couldn't understand her refusal of a salary 10 times her current compensation. I have work that matters, a community that trusts me, and the ability to see the direct impact of my decisions. That's worth more than any paycheck. The transformation hadn't been without critics. Some shareholders had initially resisted the focus on community benefit, arguing for traditional profit maximization. But the financial results had silenced most opposition. The bank's stock had tripled in value since the reforms began, proving that ethical practices drove sustainable profits. One afternoon, Catherine received an unexpected visitor, Marcus Webb's daughter, Emily. The young woman, now in law school, had requested a meeting. I wanted to apologize, Emily began, clearly nervous, for what my father did, and to thank you for not pressing additional charges that could have affected our family. Catherine studied the young woman, seeing genuine remorse. Your father paid for his crimes with prison time and restitution. You weren't responsible for his choices. Still, I wanted you to know that I'm specializing in agricultural law, Emily continued. I hope to help farmers protect their rights. Maybe it's a way to make amends. The best amends is using your skills to help others. Catherine said, if you're serious about agricultural law, we have an internship program. Harold Jensen oversees it. He believes in second chances. Emily's eyes widened. Mr. Jensen would accept me, knowing who my father is? Harold judges people by their actions, not their ancestry, Catherine assured her. Talk to him. You might be surprised. Later, Catherine shared the encounter with Harold during their regular Tuesday lunch, a tradition that had begun shortly after the reforms and continued faithfully. "Webb's daughter wants to make amends," Harold mused, considering. "Takes courage to face the people your father wronged. Will you consider her for the internship?" Harold nodded slowly. "Everyone deserves a chance to choose their own path. Maybe she'll help prevent future Webbs from emerging." Their lunch was interrupted by excited voices from the lobby. Thomas's kindergarten class had arrived for their field trip, another of Harold's initiatives to teach financial literacy to young children. "Mr. Harold!" a chorus of small voices called out as the children spotted him. Harold's weathered face lit up as he greeted each child by name. Thomas ran to Catherine, bubbling with excitement. "Mommy, we're learning about good banking and bad banking." Catherine watched Harold explain basic financial concepts using farm analogies the children could understand. Seeds were investments, harvest was returns, and helping neighbors meant everyone's farm grew stronger. "See how Mr. Peterson shares his tractor with Mr. Davis?" Harold explained. "That's like banks sharing resources with farmers. Everyone benefits." One little girl raised her hand. "My grandpa lost his farm when I was a baby. Will that happen again?" Harold's expression grew serious. "Not if we remember our lessons. That's why we're teaching you now, so your generation never forgets that banks should help communities, not hurt them." After the children left, Harold seemed thoughtful. That little girl, Sarah Martinez, her grandfather was one of the first foreclosures in the Heartland scheme. The family never recovered financially. "Is there anything we can do?" Catherine asked. "I've been thinking about a restitution fund," Harold said, "for families who lost farms before we could stop the scheme. Not just the court-ordered payments, but something more comprehensive. Education funds for the children, small business loans for those who want to start over." It was so typical of Harold, always thinking about who had been left behind, ensuring no one was forgotten in their success. Catherine immediately began working on the proposal. Within months, the Maple County Restitution Fund was established, funded by a combination of bank profits, government grants, and private donations. The Martinez family was among the first recipients, with Sarah's college education guaranteed. The ripple effects continued expanding. Business schools created case studies on the Maple County model. Law schools taught courses on agricultural, finance reform. Public policy programs analyzed how grassroots change could reshape national systems. One evening, Catherine attended a university symposium where her work was being discussed. She sat in the back, unrecognized, listening to professors debate the theoretical implications of her practical decisions. The genius of the Williams-Reynolds approach, one academic argued, was recognizing that financial systems are ultimately human systems. By rehumanizing banking, she transformed its outcomes. Another challenged, but can it be replicated without the specific circumstances of Maple County? The perfect storm of a reformist president, a committed community leader, and a crisis that demanded action. Catherine smiled to herself. Academics always wanted to complicate simple truths. Harold would have said it more plainly. When you see someone in trouble, you help. Everything else follows from that. As winter settled over the Midwest, Catherine received news that marked another milestone. The last Heartland executive had exhausted appeals and would serve his full sentence. The company itself had been dissolved, its assets distributed to victims of the foreclosure scheme. She shared the news with Harold during one of their farm visits. Thomas was learning to milk cows, his small hands guided by Harold's patient instruction. "So it's really over," Harold said, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber. "The legal battles, yes," Catherine agreed. "But the work continues. There will always be those who try to exploit the vulnerable. Our job is to make it harder for them to succeed." Harold nodded. Vigilance is like farming. You can't stop just because you had one good harvest. Thomas ran over, proud of his accomplishment. I milked a whole bucket, Mr. Harold. Fine work, Harold praised. Think you might want to be a farmer someday? Thomas considered seriously. Maybe a farmer, banker, doctor, astronaut. The adults laughed. At 5, all futures seemed possible to Thomas, a perspective Catherine tried to maintain despite the complexities of adult life. As they prepared to leave, Harold pulled Catherine aside. I've made a decision about the farm succession. Jake Wilson will take over operations, but I want to establish something else. A teaching farm for the youth programs. A place where kids like Thomas can learn where their food comes from, understand the connection between land and community. That's a wonderful idea, Catherine said. The bank would be honored to help establish it. I thought you might say that, Harold smiled. I've already drawn up the plans. We'll call it the Martha Jensen Memorial Teaching Farm. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. Even in Martha's diminished state, Harold found ways to honor her legacy. The following spring brought the teaching farm's opening. Children from across the county visited to learn about sustainable agriculture, financial literacy, and community responsibility. Harold, despite his advancing age, insisted on teaching many of the sessions himself. You can't understand money without understanding value, he told one group of high schoolers. And value isn't just about price. It's about what something means to people, to communities, to the future. Catherine watched from the barn door as Harold demonstrated planting techniques, his movements slower but still sure. Thomas worked alongside him, the 5-year-old absorbing lessons that went far beyond agriculture. The transformation was complete, but not finished, if transformation ever truly ends. The bank Catherine led bore little resemblance to the institution that had threatened Harold's farm 5 years earlier. But more importantly, the banking industry itself had changed, forced to recognize that community partnership created more sustainable profits than exploitation ever could. As summer approached, Catherine received an invitation that brought her journey full circle. The American Bankers Association was presenting her with their Lifetime Achievement Award. At age 42, the youngest recipient ever. Will you come with me? She asked Harold. You deserve the recognition as much as I do, Harold demurred. Awards aren't my style. Besides, someone needs to watch the farm. But when the evening came, Harold was there in the audience, wearing his best suit and beaming with pride as Catherine accepted the award. In her speech, she told the story that had become legend in banking circles, a farmer who stopped to help a stranger in a storm, unknowingly saving his own farm and transforming an industry. Harold Jensen taught me that banking isn't about maximizing profits, she concluded. It's about maximizing community prosperity. When banks remember that, everyone thrives. The standing ovation was led by Harold, tears visible on his weathered cheeks. Later, at the reception, Catherine found Harold surrounded by young bankers, all eager to hear his insights. He had become an unlikely celebrity in financial circles, the farmer whose wisdom had reshaped their industry. Remember, he was telling them, every loan application represents a family, a dream, a piece of community fabric. Treat it with the respect it deserves. Catherine smiled, watching her son distribute Harold's business cards, something Jake Wilson had insisted on creating, despite Harold's protests. Harold Jensen, agricultural wisdom consultant, they read, with a photo of the teaching farm. As the evening wound down, Catherine and Harold stepped onto a balcony overlooking the city. Lights twinkled below, each representing lives and businesses and dreams. Did you ever imagine it would lead to this? Catherine asked. Harold shook his head. I just wanted to save my farm. Maybe help a few neighbors. He gestured at the gala behind them. This is beyond anything I dreamed. You changed the world, Harold. We changed a piece of it, he corrected. And Thomas's generation will change more. That's how progress works. Each generation building. On the last, Thomas ran out to join them, clutching a cookie from the dessert table. "Mummy, that man in there said I'm famous. He saw our picture in a magazine." Catherine lifted her son, holding him close. "You're famous for having a very special friend," she said, nodding toward Harold. "Mr. Harold's the best," Thomas agreed, offering the older man a bite of his cookie. As they stood together on the balcony, the banker, the farmer, and the child who bridged their worlds, the city lights seemed to pulse with possibility. Somewhere, in those lights, were families keeping their homes because predatory lending had been curtailed. Somewhere were young farmers starting operations because credit was accessible. Somewhere were communities thriving because banks had remembered their true purpose. The storm that had brought them together was now just a memory, but its effects rippled outward in waves of change that would last generations. Harold Jensen had stopped to help a stranger, and in doing so, had helped transform American banking. As they prepared to leave, Harold took a last look at the celebration inside. "You know what Martha would say about all this fuss?" Catherine smiled, imagining the practical woman Harold had described so lovingly. "She'd probably say it's nice. But the real work happens in the fields and the community, not at fancy parties." "Exactly." Harold chuckled. She always did have the right perspective. They walked back inside together, Thomas between them, hand in hand with both. The little boy who'd been born into the midst of banking reform would grow up in a world where financial institutions served communities rather than exploiting them. It was a legacy worth more than any award. As they said their goodbyes, Harold pulled Catherine aside one final time. "I want you to know something," he said seriously. "That night you showed up at my door, I was ready to give up, not just on the farm, but on believing things could be different. You gave me hope when I had none left. You gave me purpose when I was just managing assets," Catherine replied. "We saved each other." Harold nodded, emotion thick in his voice. "Take care of yourself, Catherine, and that boy of yours. He's going to do great things. With you as his example, how could he not?" They parted with a hug, the formal banker and the practical farmer who had forged an unlikely partnership that changed an industry. As Catherine drove home, Thomas asleep in his car seat, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. 5 years ago, she had been a pregnant woman stranded in a storm, focused only on her immediate predicament. Now she was a leader in banking reform, a mother and a friend to the most unlikely of mentors. The storm had passed, but its blessings continued. In boardrooms and farm fields, in classrooms and courtrooms, the changes they had wrought continued to spread. The message was simple, but revolutionary. When financial institutions remember their human purpose, everyone prospers. Harold still farmed his land, though Jake Wilson increasingly managed daily operations. The teaching farm drew visitors from around the world. Martha, in her care facility, had good days and difficult ones, but was always surrounded by love and the dignity that financial security provided. And in the heart of it all, a principle endured, one that Harold had lived without fanfare, and Catherine had learned through experience. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simple decision to help someone in need. The rest, as Harold would say, was just good farming. Plant the seeds of kindness, tend them carefully, and trust in the harvest to come. As she pulled into her driveway, Catherine saw her porch light on. David had waited up for her, as he always did after these events. Inside, her husband would want to hear every detail, to celebrate her success while keeping her grounded in the daily realities of family life. She lifted Thomas from his car seat, his small body warm and trusting against hers. Someday, she would tell him the full story of Harold Jensen and the night that changed everything. She would tell him about courage and kindness, about standing against corruption even when it seemed hopeless. But most of all, she would tell him about the power of human connection to transform systems that seemed too big to change. For now, she carried her sleeping son inside, grateful for the storm that had brought Harold Jensen into their lives, and for the man who had stopped to help a stranger on a dark, rain-soaked road. The ripples from that act of kindness would continue spreading for generations, proof that goodness, once set in motion, could indeed change the world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.